Chapter 5 of The Conquest of Canaan by Booth Tarkington. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 5 Beaver Beach. The Canaan Daily Tocsin of the following morning ventured the assertion upon its front page that the scene at the Pike Mansion was one of unalloyed festivity, music, and mirth. The fairy bower of airy figures wafting here and there to the throb of waltz strains, a veritable temple of terpsichord shining forth with a myriad of lights, which, together with the generous profusion of floral decorations, and the mingled delights afforded by Mines Orchestra of Indianapolis and Caterer Jones of Chicago, was in all likelihood never heretofore surpassed in elegance in our city. Only one incident, the Tocsin remarked, marred an otherwise perfect occasion, and out of regard for the culprit's family connections which are prominent in our social world, we withhold his name. Suffice it to say that through the vigilance of Mr. Norbert Flitcroft, grandson of Colonel A. Flitcroft, who proved himself a thorough Lecoq, the celebrated French detective, the rascal was seized and recognized. Mr. Flitcroft, having discovered him in hiding, had a cordon of waiters drawn up around his hiding place, which was the charmingly decorated side piazza of the Pike Mansion, and sent for Judge Pike, who came upon the intruder by surprise. He evaded the Judge's indignant grasp, but received a well-merited blow over the head from a poker which the Judge had concealed about his person while pretending to approach the hiding-place casually. Attracted to the scene by the cries was Mr. Flitcroft, who, standing behind Judge Pike, accidentally received a blow from the same weapon. All the guests of the evening sprang to view the scene, only to behold the culprit leap through a crevice between the strips of canvas which enclosed the piazza. He was seized by the colored coachman of the mansion, Sam Warden, and immediately pounced upon by the cordon of Caterer Jones' dusky assistants from Chicago, who were in ambush outside. Unfortunately, after a brief struggle, he managed to trip Warden, and, the others stumbling upon the prostrate body of the latter, to make his escape in the darkness. It is not believed by many that his intention was burglary, though what his designs were can only be left to conjecture, as he is far beyond the age when boys perform such actions out of a sense of mischief. He had evidently occupied his hiding place some time, and an idea of his coolness may be obtained from his having procured and eaten a full meal through an unknown source. Judge Pike is justly incensed, and swears that he will prosecute him on this and other charges as soon as he can be found. Much sympathy is felt for the culprit's family, who feel his shame most keenly, but who, though sorrowing over the occurrence, declare that they have put up with his derelictions long enough, and will do nothing to step between him and the Judge's righteous indignation. The Pike Mansion, scene of festivity, music, and mirth, not quite so unalloyed, after all, the stricken Flitcroft keeping his room for a week under medical supervision, had not been the only bower of the dance in Canaan that evening. Another temple of terpsichord had shone forth with lights, though in these there were not quite a myriad. The festivities they illuminated obtained no mention in the paper, nor did they who trod the measures in this second temple exhibit any sense of injury because of the Tocsin's omission. Nay, they were of that class, shy without being bashful, exclusive yet not proud, which shuns publicity with a single-heartedness almost unique in our republic, courting observation neither in the prosecution of their professions nor in the pursuit of happiness. Not quite a mile above the northernmost of the factories on the waterfront, there projected into the river, near the end of the crescent bend above the town, a long pier, relic of steamboat days, rotting now, and many years fallen from its maritime uses. About midway of its length stood a huge, crazy shed, long ago utilized as a freight storeroom. This had been patched and propped, and a dangerous-looking veranda attached to it overhanging the water. Above the doorway was placed a sign, whereon might be read the words, "Beaver Beach, Mike's Place." The shore end of the pier was so ruinous that passage was offered by a single row of planks, which presented an appearance so temporary, as well as insecure, that one might have guessed their office to be something in the nature of a drawbridge. From these a narrow path ran through a marsh, left by the receding river, to a country road of desolate appearance. Here there was a rough enclosure, or corral, with some tumble-down sheds, which afforded shelter on the night of Joseph Louden's disgrace, for a number of shaggy teams attached to those decrepit and musty vehicles known picturesquely and accurately as night hawks. The presence of such questionable shapes in the corral indicated that the dance was on at Beaver Beach, Mike's Place, as surely as the short line of cabs and family carriages on Upper Main Street made it known that gaiety was the order of the night at the Pike Mansion. But among other differences was this, that at the hour when the guests of the latter were leaving, those seeking the hospitalities of Beaver Beach had just begun to arrive. By 3 o'clock, however, joy at Mike's Place had become beyond question unconfined, and the tokens of it were audible for a long distance in all directions. If, however, there is no sound where no ear hears, silence rested upon the countryside until an hour later. Then a lonely figure came shivering from the direction of the town, not by the road, but slinking through the snow upon the frozen river. It came slowly, as though very tired, and cautiously, too, often turning its head to look behind. Finally it reached the pier and stopped as if to listen. Within the house above, a piano of evil life was being beaten to death for its sins and clamoring its last cries horribly. The old shed rattled in every part with the thud of many heavy feet, and trembled with the shock of noise, an incessant roar of men's voices, punctuated with women's screams. Then the riot quieted somewhat. There was a clapping of hands, and a violin began to squeak measures intended to be Oriental. The next moment the listener scrambled up one of the rotting piles and stood upon the veranda. A shaft of red light through a broken shutter struck across the figure above the shoulders, revealing a bloody handkerchief clumsily knotted about the head, and beneath it the face of Joe Louden. He went to the broken shutter and looked in. Around the blackened walls of the room stood a blurred mob, applausively watching through a fog of smoke the contortions of an old woman in a red calico wrapper who was dancing in the center of the floor. The fiddler, a rubicund person evidently not suffering from any great depression of spirit through the circumstance of being out on bail, as he was to Joe's intimate knowledge, sat astride a barrel, resting his instrument upon the foamy tap thereof, and playing somewhat after the manner of a cellist, in no wise incommoded by the fact that a tall man, known to a few friends as an expert in the porch climbing line, was sleeping on his shoulder, while another gentleman, who had prevented many cases of typhoid by removing old plumbing from houses, lay on the floor at the musician's feet, and endeavored to assist him by plucking the strings of the fiddle. Joe opened the door and went in. All the merry company, who were able, turned sharply toward the door as it opened, then, recognizing the newcomer, turned again to watch the old woman. One or two nearest the door asked the boy, without great curiosity, what had happened to his head. He merely shook it faintly in reply and crossed the room to an open hallway beyond. At the end of this he came to a frowsy bedroom, the door of which stood ajar. Seated at a deal table and working by a dim lamp with a broken chimney, A close-cropped, red-bearded, red-haired man in his shirt-sleeves was jabbing gloomily at a column of figures scrawled in a dirty ledger. He looked up as Joe appeared in the doorway, and his eyes showed a slight surprise. "I never thought you had the temper to get somebody to split your head," said he. "Where'd you collect it?" "Nowhere," Joe answered, dropping weakly on the bed. "It doesn't amount to anything." "Well, I'll just take a look for it myself," said the red-bearded man, rising. "And I've no objection to not knowing how you come by it. You've always been the great one for keeping your mysteries to yourself." He unwound the handkerchief and removed it from Joe's head gently. "Whee!" he cried, as a long gash was exposed over the forehead. "I hope ye left a mark somewhere to pay a little on the score of this." Joe chuckled and dropped dizzily back upon the pillow. "There was another who got something like it," he gasped feebly. "And, oh, Mike, I wish you could have heard him going on. Perhaps you did. It was only 3 miles from here." "Nothing I'd like better," said the other, bringing a basin of clear water from a stand in the corner. "It's a beautiful thing to hear a man holler when he gets a grand one like you're wearing to night." He bathed the wound gently, and hurrying from the room, returned immediately with a small jug of vinegar. Wetting a rag with this tender fluid, he applied it to Joe's head, speaking soothingly the while. "Nothing in the world like a bit of good cider vinegar to keep off the festering. It may seem a trifle scratchy for the moment, but it assassinates the blood poison. There you go. It's the fine thing for you, Joe. What are you squirming about?" "I'm only enjoying it," the boy answered, writhing as the vinegar worked into the gash. "Don't you mind my laughing to myself." "You're a good one, Joe," said the other, continuing his ministrations. "I wisht, after all, you felt like making me known to what's the trouble. There's some of us would be glad to take it up for you, and—" "No, no, it's all right. I was somewhere I had no business to be, and I got caught." "Who caught you?" "First, some nice white people." Joe smiled his distorted smile. "And then a low-down black man helped me to get away, as soon as he saw who it was. He's a friend of mine, and he fell down and tripped up the pursuit. I always knew you'd get into large trouble some day." The red-bearded man tore a strip from an old towel and began to bandage the boy's head with an accustomed hand. "Your taste for excitement has been growing on you every minute of the 4 years I've known you." "Excitement!" echoed Joe, painfully blinking at his friend. "You think I'm hunting excitement?" "Be hanged to you," said the red-bearded man. "Can't I say a teasing word without getting called to order for it? I know you, my boy, as well as you know yourself. You're a queer one. You're one of the few that must know all sides of the world and can't content themselves with being respectable. Ye haven't sunk to low life because you're low yourself, but you'll never get a damned one of the respectable to believe it. There's a few others like you in the wide world, and I've seen one or two of them. I've been all over, steeplechasing, sailorman, soldier, peddler, and in the police. I've pulled the Grand National in Paris, and I've been handcuffed in Hong Kong. I've seen all the few kinds of women there is on earth and the many kinds of men. Your own kind is the one I've seen the fewest of. But I knew ye belonged to it the first time I laid eyes on you." He paused, then continued with conviction. "Ye'll come to no good either for yourself, yet no one can say ye haven't the talents. You've helped many a boy out of a bad hole with a word of advice around the courts and the jail. Who knows but ye'd be a great lawyer if you kept on." Young people usually like to discuss themselves under any conditions. Hence the rewards of palmistry. But Joe's comment on this harangue was not so responsive as might have been expected. "I've got $7," he said, "and I'll leave the clothes I've got on. Can you fix me up with something different?" "Aha!" cried the red-bearded man. "Then you are in trouble. I thought it'd come to you some day. Have you been dinnymitting Martin Pike?" "See what you can do," said Joe. "I want to wait here until daybreak." "Lie down, then," interrupted the other. and forget the hullabaloo in the throne room beyond. I can easily do that. Joe stretched himself upon the bed. I've got so many other things to remember. I'll have the things for you, and I'll let you know I have no use for $7, returned the red-bearded man crossly. What are you sniffing for? I'm thinking of the poor fellow that got the mate to this, said Joe, touching the bandage. I can't help crying when I think they may have used vinegar on his head, too. Get to sleep if you can, exclaimed the Samaritan, as a hideous burst of noise came from the dance room, where someone seemed to be breaking a chair upon an acquaintance. I'll go out and regulate the boys a bit. He turned down the lamp, fumbled in his hip pocket, and went to the door. Don't forget, Joe called after him. Go to sleep, said the red-bearded man, his hand on the doorknob. That is, go to thinking, for you won't sleep. You're not the kind. But think easy. I'll have the things for you. It's a matter of pride with me that I always knew you'd come to trouble. End of chapter 5. Chapter 6 of The Conquest of Canaan by Booth Tarkington. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 6. You'll take the high road and I'll take the low road. The day broke with a scream of wind out of the prairies and such cloudbursts of snow that Joe could see neither bank of the river as he made his way down the big bend of ice. The wind struck so bitterly that now and then he stopped and, panting and gasping, leaned his weight against it. The snow on the ground was caught up and flew like sea spume in a hurricane. It swirled about him, joining the flakes in the air, so that it seemed to be snowing from the ground upward as much as from the sky downward. Fierce as it was, hard as it was to fight through, snow from the earth, snow from the sky, Joe was grateful for it, feeling that it veiled him, making him safer, though he trusted somewhat the change of costume he had effected at Beaver Beach. A rough workman's cap was pulled down over his ears and eyebrows. A knitted comforter was wound about the lower part of his face. Under a ragged overcoat he wore blue overalls and rubber boots, and in one of his red-mittened hands he swung a tin dinner bucket. When he reached the nearest of the factories he heard the exhaust of its engines long before he could see the building, so blinding was the drift. Here he struck inland from the river, and, skirting the edges of the town, made his way by unfrequented streets and alleys, bearing in the general direction of Upper Main Street, to find himself at last, almost exhausted, in the alley behind the Pike mansion. There he paused, leaning heavily against a board fence and gazing at the vaguely outlined gray plain which was all that could be made of the house through the blizzard. He had often, very often, stood in this same place at night, and there was one window, Mrs. Pike's, which he had guessed to be Mamie's. The storm was so thick that he could not see this window now, but he looked a long time through the thickness of that part of the gray plain where he knew it was. Then his lips parted. "Good-bye, Mamie," he said, softly. "Good-bye, Mamie." He bent his body against the wind and went on, still keeping to the back ways, until he came to the alley which passed behind his own home, where, however, he paused only for a moment to make a quick survey of the premises. A glance satisfied him. He ran to the next fence, hoisted himself warily over it, and dropped into Roger Tabor's backyard. He took shelter from the wind for a moment or two, leaning against the fence, breathing heavily. Then he stumbled on across the obliterated paths of a vegetable garden until he reached the house, and beginning with the kitchen, began to make the circuit of the windows, peering cautiously into each as he went, ready to tap on the pane should he catch a glimpse of Ariel, and prepare to run if he stumbled upon her grandfather. But the place seemed empty. He had made his reconnaissance apparently in vain, and was on the point of going away when he heard the click of the front gate and saw Ariel coming towards him, her old waterproof cloak about her head and shoulders, the patched, scant, faded skirt which he knew so well blowing about her tumultuously. At the sound of the gate he had crouched close against the side of the house, but she saw him at once. She stopped abruptly, and throwing the waterproof back from her head, looked at him through the driven fog of snow. One of her hands was stretched towards him involuntarily, and it was in that attitude that he long remembered her, standing in the drift which had piled up against the gate almost knee-deep, the shabby skirt and the black waterproof flapping like torn sails, one hand outstretched like that of a figure in a tableau, her brown face with its thin features mottled with cold and unlovely, her startled eyes fixed on him with a strange, wild tenderness that held something of the laughter of whole companionship in it, mingling with a loyalty and championship that was almost ferocious. She looked an undine of the snow. Suddenly she ran to him, still keeping her hand outstretched until it touched his own. "How did you know me?" he said. "Know you?" was all the answer she made to that question. "Come into the house. I've got some coffee on the stove for you. I've been up and down the street waiting for you ever since it began to get light. Your grandfather won't. He's at Uncle Jonas's. He won't be back till noon. There's no one here." She led him to the front door, where he stamped and shook himself. He was snow from head to foot. "I'm running away from the good Gomorrah," he said. "But I've stopped to look back, and I'm a pretty white pillar." "I know where you stopped to look back," she answered, brushing him heartily with her red hands. "You came in the alleyway. It was Mamie's window." He did not reply, and the only visible token that he had any consciousness of this clairvoyance of hers was a slight lift of his higher eyebrow. She wasted no time in getting him to the kitchen, where, when she had removed his overcoat, she placed him in a chair, unwound the comforter, and, as carefully as a nurse, lifted the cap from his injured head. When the strip of towel was disclosed, she stood quite still for a moment with the cap in her hand. Then, with a broken little cry, she stooped and kissed a lock of his hair, which escaped discolored beneath the bandage. "Stop that!" he commanded, horribly embarrassed. "Oh, Joe," she cried, I knew it was there, but to see it! And it's my fault for leaving you. I had to go, or I wouldn't have Where'd you hear about it?" he asked, shortly. "I haven't been to bed," she answered. "Grandfather and I were up all night at Uncle Jonas's, and Colonel Flitcroft came about 2 o'clock, and he told us." "Did he tell you about Norbert?" "Yes, a great deal." She poured coffee into a cup from a pot on the stove, brought it to him, then, placing some thin slices of bread upon a gridiron, began to toast them over the hot coals. "The Colonel said that Norbert thought he wouldn't get well," she concluded, "and Mr. Arp said Norbert was the kind that never die, and they had quite an argument." "What were you doing at Jonas Tabor's?" asked Joe, drinking his coffee with a brightening eye. "We were sent for," she answered. "What for?" She toasted the bread attentively, without replying, and when she decided that it was brown enough, piled it on a warm plate. This she brought to him, and, kneeling in front of him, her elbow on his knee, offered for his consideration, looking steadfastly up at his eyes. He began to eat ravenously. "What for?" he repeated. "I didn't suppose Jonas would let you come in his house. Was he sick?" "Joe," she said quietly, disregarding his questions, "Joe, have you got to run away?" "Yes, I've got to," he answered. "Would you have to go to prison if you stayed?" She asked this with a breathless tensity. "I'm not going to beg Father to help me out," he said determinedly. "He said he wouldn't, and he'll be spared the chance. He won't mind that. Nobody will care. Nobody. What does anybody care what I do?" "Now you're thinking of Mamie," she cried. "I can always tell. Whenever you don't talk naturally, you're thinking of her." He poured down the last of the coffee, growing red to the tips of his ears. "Ariel," he said, "if I ever come back—" "Wait," she interrupted. "Would you have to go to prison right away if they caught you?" "Oh, it isn't that." He laughed, sadly. "But I'm going to clear out. I'm not going to take any chances. I want to see other parts of the world, other kinds of people. I might have gone anyhow, soon, even if it hadn't been for last night. Don't you ever feel that way?" "You know I do," she said. "I've told you. How often? But, Joe, you haven't any money. You've got to have money to live." "You needn't worry about that," returned the master of $7 genially. "I've saved enough to take care of me for a long time." "Joe, please! I know it isn't so. If you could wait just a little while, only a few weeks, only a few, Joe." "What for?" "I could let you have all you want. It would be such a beautiful thing for me, Joe. Oh, I know how you would feel. You wouldn't even let me give you that dollar I found in the street last year. But this would be only lending it to you, and you could pay me back sometime." "Ariel!" he exclaimed, and setting his empty cup upon the floor, took her by the shoulders and shook her till the empty plate which had held the toast dropped from her hand and broke into fragments. "You've been reading the Arabian Nights." "No, no!" she cried, vehemently. "Grandfather would give me anything. He'll give me all the money I ask for." "Money!" said Joe. "Which of us is wandering? Money? Roger Tabor give you money?" "Not for a while. A great many things have to be settled first." "What things?" "Joe," she asked earnestly, "do you think it's bad of me not to feel things I ought to feel?" "No." "Then I'm glad," she said, and something in the way she spoke made him start with pain, remembering the same words, spoken in the same tone by another voice, the night before on the veranda. "I'm glad, Joe, because I seemed all wrong to myself. Uncle Jonas died last night, and I haven't been able to get sorry. Perhaps it's because I've been so frightened about you, but I think not, for I wasn't sorry even before Colonel Flitcroft told me about you." "Jonas Tabor dead?" said Joe. "Why, I saw him on the street yesterday." "Yes, and I saw him just before I came out on the porch where you were. He was there in the hall. He and Judge Pike had been having a long talk. They'd been in some speculations together, and it had all turned out well. It's very strange, but they say now that Uncle Jonas's heart was weak. He was an old man, you know, almost 80, and he had been very anxious about his money. The Judge had persuaded him to risk it, and the shock of finding that he had made a great deal, suddenly—" "I've heard he had had that same shock before," said Joe, "when he sold out to your father." "Yes, but this was different, Grandfather says. He told me it was one of those big risky businesses that Judge Pike likes to go into, and last night it was all finished, the strain was over, and Uncle Jonas started home. His house was only a little way from the Pikes, you know, but he dropped down in the snow at his own gate, and some people who were going by saw him fall. He was dead before Grandfather got there." "I can't be sorry," said Joe, slowly. "Neither can I. That's the dreadful part of it. They say he hadn't made a will, that though he was sharper than anybody else in the whole world about any other matter of business, that was the one thing he put off, and we're all the kin he had in the world, Grandfather and I. And they say," her voice sank to a whisper of excitement, "they say he was richer than anybody knew, and that this last business with Judge Pike, the very thing that killed him, something about grain, made him 5 times richer than before." She put her hand on the boy's arm, and he let it remain there. Her eyes still sought his with a tremulous appeal. "God bless you, Ariel," he said. "It's going to be a great thing for you." "Yes, yes, it is." The tears came suddenly to her eyes. "I was foolish last night, but there had been such a long time of wanting things, and now Grandfather and I can go." "You're going too?" Joe chuckled. "It's heartless, I suppose, but I've settled it. We're going." "I know," he cried. "You've told me 1,000 times what he's said. 10 times 1,000. You're going to Paris." "Paris, yes, that's it, to Paris, where he can see at last how the great ones have painted, where the others can show him. To Paris, where we can study together, where he can learn how to put the pictures he sees upon canvas, and where I " "Go on," Joe encouraged her. "I want to hear you say it. You don't mean that you're going to study painting. You mean that you're going to learn how to make such fellows as Eugene ask you to dance. Go ahead and say it." "Yes, to learn how to dress," she said. Joe was silent for a moment. Then he rose and took the ragged overcoat from the back of his chair. "Where's that muffler?" he asked. She brought it from where she had placed it to dry, behind the stove. "Joe," she said, huskily, "can't you wait till the estate is settled and you can coax your grandfather to " "No, no. But you could go with us." "To Paris?" "He would take you as his secretary." "Aha!" Joe's voice rang out gayly as he rose, refreshed by the coffee, toast, and warmth she had given him. "You've been story reading, Ariel, like Eugene. Secretary!" "Please, Joe." "Where's my tin dinner pail?" He found it himself upon the table where he had set it down. "I'm going to earn a dishonest living," he went on. "I have an engagement to take a freight at a water tank that's a friend of mine, half a mile south of the yards. Thank God I'm going to get away from Canaan." "Wait, Joe." She caught at his sleeve. "I want you to " He had swung out of the room, and was already at the front door. She followed him closely. "Good bye, Ariel." "No, no. Wait, Joe." He took her right hand in his own and gave it a manly shake. "It's all right," he said. He threw open the door and stepped out, but she sought to detain him. "Oh, have you got to go?" she cried. "Don't you ever worry about me." He bent his head to the storm as he sprang down the steps, and snow wreaths swirled between them. He disappeared in a white whirlwind. She stood for several minutes shivering in the doorway. Then it came to her that she would not know where to write to him. She ran down to the gate and through it. Already the blizzard had covered his footprints. End of chapter 6. Chapter 7 of The Conquest of Canaan by Booth Tarkington. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 7. Give a Dog a Bad Name. The passing of Joseph from Canaan was complete. It was an evanishment for which there was neither sackcloth nor surprise, and though there came no news of him, it cannot be said that Canaan did not hear of him, for surely it could hear itself talk. The death of Jonas Tabor and young Louden's crime and flight incited high doings in the "National House" windows. Many days the sages lingered with the broken meats of morals left over from the banquet of gossip. But after all, it is with the ladies of the community that reputations finally rest, and the matrons of Canaan had long ago made Joe's exceedingly uncertain. Now they made it certain. They did not fail of assistance. The most powerful influence in the town was ponderously corroborative. Martin Pike, who stood for all that was respectable and financial, who passed the plate o' Sundays, who held the fortunes of the town in his left hand, who was trustee for the widow and orphan, Martin Pike, patron of all worthy charities, courted by ministers, feared by the wicked and idle, revered by the good. Judge Martin Pike never referred to the runaway save in the accents of an august doomster. His testimony settled it. In time, the precise nature of the fugitive's sins was distorted in report and grew vague. It was recalled that he had done dread things. He became a tradition, a legend, and a warning to the young, a Richard in the bush to frighten colts. He was preached at boys caught playing marbles for keeps. Do you want to grow up like Joe Louden? The very name became a darkling threat, and children of the town would have run had one called suddenly, "Here comes Joe Louden." Thus does the evil men do live after them, and the ill fame of the unrighteous increase when they are sped. Very little of Joseph's adventures and occupations during the time of his wandering is revealed to us. He always had an unwilling memory for pain, and was not afterwards wont to speak of those years which cut the hard lines in his face. The first account of him to reach Canaan came as directly to the windows of the "National House" as Mr. Arp, hastening thither from the station, satchel in hand, could bring it. This was a September morning, 2 years after the flight, and Eskew, it appears, had been to the State Fair, and had beheld many things strangely affirming his constant testimony that this unhappy world increaseth in sin. Strangest of all, his meeting with our vagrant scallywag of Canaan. "Not a blame bit of doubt about it," declared Eskew to the incredulous conclave. "There was that Joe, and nobody else, stuck up in a little box outside a tent at the fairgrounds, and selling tickets to see the spotted wild boy. Yes, it was Joe Louden. Think you Mr. Arp could forget that face, those crooked eyebrows?" Had Eskew tested the recognition? Had he spoken with the outcast? Had he not? Ay, but with such peculiar result that the battle of words among the sages began with the true onset of the regulars. For, according to Eskew's narrative, when he had delivered grimly at the boy this charge, "I know you, you're Joe Louden," the extraordinary reply had been made promptly and without change of countenance: "Positively, no free seats." On this the House divided, one party maintaining that Joe had thus endeavored to evade recognition; the other, to the embitterment of Mr. Arp, that the reply was a distinct admission of identity, and at the same time a refusal to grant any favors on the score of past acquaintanceship. Goaded by inquiries, Mr. Arp, who had little desire to recall such waste of silver, admitted more than he had intended, that he had purchased a ticket and gone in to see the spotted wild boy, halting in his description of this marvel with the unsatisfactory and acrid statement that the wild boy was simply spotted. And the stung query, "I suppose you know what a spot is, Squire?" When he came out of the tent he had narrowly examined the ticket seller, who seemed unaware of his scrutiny, and, when not engaged with his tickets, applied himself to a dirty, law-looking book. It was Joe Louden, reasserted Eskew, a little taller, a little paler, incredibly shabby and miraculously thin. If there were any doubt left, his forehead was somewhat disfigured by the scar of an old wound, such as might have been caused by a blunt instrument in the nature of a poker. "What's the matter with you?" Mr. Arp whirled upon Uncle Joe Davy, who was enjoying himself by repeating at intervals the unreasonable words, "Couldn't have been Joe," without any explanation. "Why couldn't it?" shouted Eskew. "It was. Do you think my eyes are as fur gone as yours? I saw him, I tell you. The same ornery Joe Louden, run away and selling tickets for a side show. He wasn't even the boss of it. The manager was about the meanest looking human I ever saw, and most humans look mighty mean, according to my way of thinking. Riffraff of the riffraff are his friends now, same as they were here. Weeds. And he's a weed, always was and always will be. Him and his kind ain't any more than Jimpsons. Overrun everything if you give 'em a chance. Devil flowers. They have to be hoed out and scattered. Even then, like as not, they'll come back next year and ruin your plantin' once more. That boy Joe will turn up here again some day. You'll see if he don't. He's a seed of trouble and iniquity, and anything of that kind is sure to come back to Canaan." Mr. Arp stuck to his prediction for several months. Then he began to waver and evade. By the end of the second year following its first utterance, he had formed the habit of denying that he had ever made it at all, and finally having come to believe with all his heart that the prophecy had been deliberately foisted upon him and put in his mouth by Squire Buckalew, became so sore upon the subject that even the hardiest dared not to refer to it in his presence. Eskew's story of the ticket seller was the only news of Joe Louden that came to Canaan during 7 years. Another citizen of the town encountered the wanderer, however, but under circumstances so susceptible to misconception that in a moment of illumination he decided to let the matter rest in a golden silence. This was Mr. Bantry. Having elected an elaborate course in the arts at the university which was of his possessions, what more natural than that Eugene should seek the metropolis for the short Easter vacation of his senior year, in order that his perusal of the masters should be uninterrupted? But it was his misfortune to find the Metropolitan Museum less interesting than some intricate phases of the gaiety of New York, phases very difficult to understand without elaborate study and a series of experiments which the discreetly selfish permit others to make for them. Briefly, Eugene found himself dancing one night with a young person in a big hat at the Straw Cellar, a crowded hall, down very deep in the town and not at all the place for Eugene. Acute cries are to be expected at the Straw Cellar, and Eugene was the only one present who was thoroughly surprised when that of this night arrived, though all of the merrymakers were frightened when they perceived its extent. There is no need to detail the catastrophe. It came suddenly, and the knife did not flash. Sick and thinking of himself, Eugene stood staring at the figure lying before him upon the reddening floor. A rabble fought with the quick policemen at the doors, and then the lights went out, extinguished by the proprietor, living up to his reputation for always being thoughtful of his patrons. The place had been a nightmare. It became a black impossibility. Eugene staggered to one of the open windows, from the sill of which a man had just leaped. "Don't jump," said a voice close to his ear. "That fellow broke his leg, I think, and they caught him anyway as soon as he struck the pavement. It's a big raid. Come this way." A light hand fell upon his arm, and he followed its leading, blindly to find himself pushed through a narrow doorway and down a flight of tricky wooden steps, at the foot of which, silhouetted against a street light, a tall policeman was on guard. He laid masterful hands on Eugene. "Sh, Mac," whispered a cautious voice from the stairway. "That's a friend of mine, and not one of those you need. He's only a student and scared to death." "Hurry," said the policeman under his breath, twisting Eugene sharply by him into the street, after which he stormed vehemently. "On your way, both of you. Move on up the street. Don't be trying to poke your heads in here. You'll be more anxious to get out once you get in, I tell you." A sob of relief came upon Bantry as he gained the next corner, the slight figure of his conductor at his side. "You'd better not go to places like the Straw Cellar," said the latter, gravely. "I've been watching you for an hour. You were dancing with the girl who did the cutting." Eugene leaned against a wall, faint, one arm across his face. He was too ill to see or care who it was that had saved him. "I never saw her before," he babbled incoherently. "Never, never, never. I thought she looked handsome and asked her if she'd dance with me. Then I saw she seemed queer and wild, and she kept guiding and pushing as we danced until we were near that man, and then it was all done before." "Yes," said the other. "She's been threatening to do it for a long time. Jealous. Mighty good sort of a girl, though, in lots of ways. Only yesterday I talked with her and almost thought I'd calmed her out of it. But you can't tell with some women. They'll brighten up and talk straight and seem sensible one minute and promise to behave and mean it, too, and the next, there they go, making a scene, cutting somebody, or killing themselves. You can't count on them. But that's not to the point exactly, I expect. You'd better keep away from the Straw Cellar. If you'd been caught with the rest, you'd have had a hard time. And they'd have found out your real name, too, because it's pretty serious on account of your dancing with her when she did it. And the Canaan papers would have got hold of it, and you wouldn't have been invited to Judge Pike's any more, Eugene." Eugene dropped his arm from his eyes and stared into the face of his step-brother. "Joe Louden!" he gasped. "I'll never tell," said Joe. "You'd better keep out of all this sort. You don't understand it. And you don't do it because you care. He smiled wanly, his odd, distorted smile of friendliness. "When you go back, you might tell father I'm all right. I'm working through a law school here. And remember me to Norbert Flitcroft," he finished, with a chuckle. Eugene covered his eyes again, and groaned. "It's all right," Joe assured him. "You're as safe as if it had never happened. And I expect," he went on, thoughtfully, "I expect, maybe, you'd prefer not to say you'd seen me when you go back to Canaan. Well, that's all right. I don't suppose father will be asking after me, exactly." "No, he doesn't," said Eugene, still white and shaking. "Don't stand talking. I'm sick." "Of course," returned Joe. "But there's one thing I would like to ask you. Your father's health is perfect, I believe?" It's something else," Joe stammered pitifully. Are they all right at Judge Pike's?" "Quite," Eugene replied, sharply. "Are you going to get me away from here? I'm sick, I tell you." "This street," said Joe, and cheerfully led the way. 5 minutes later the two had parted, and Joe leaned against a cheap restaurant signboard, drearily staring after the lamps of the gypsy night cab he had found for his step brother. Eugene had not offered to share the vehicle with him, had not even replied to his good night. And Joe himself had neglected to do something he might well have done. He had not asked Eugene for news of Ariel Tabor. It will not justify him entirely to suppose that he assumed that her grandfather and she had left Canaan never to return, and therefore Eugene knew nothing of her. No such explanation serves Joe for his neglect, for the fair truth is that he had not thought of her. She had been a sort of playmate before his flight, a friend taken for granted, about whom he had consciously thought little more than he thought about himself, and easily forgotten. Not forgotten in the sense that she had passed out of his memory, but forgotten none the less. She had never had a place in his imaginings, and so it befell that when he no longer saw her from day to day, she had gone from his thoughts altogether. End of chapter 7. Chapter 8 of The Conquest of Canaan by Booth Tarkington. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 8. A Bad Penny Turns Up. Eugene did not inform Canaan nor any inhabitant of his adventure of the straw cellar, nor did any hear of his meeting with his stepbrother. And after Mr. Arp's adventure 5 years passed into the imperishable before the town heard of the wanderer again, and then it heard it at first hand. Mr. Arp's prophecy fell true, and he took it back to his bosom again, claimed it as his own the morning of its fulfillment. Joe Louden had come back to Canaan. The elder Louden was the first to know of his prodigal's return. He was alone in the office of the wooden butter dish factory, of which he was the superintendent, when the young man came in unannounced. He was still pale and thin. His eyebrows had the same crook, one corner of his mouth the same droop. He was only an inch or so taller, not enough to be thought a tall man. And yet for a few moments the father did not recognize his son, but stared at him, inquiring his business. During those few seconds of unrecognition, Mr. Louden was somewhat favorably impressed with the stranger's appearance. "You don't know me," said Joe, smiling cheerfully. "Perhaps I've changed in 7 years." And he held out his hand. Then Mr. Louden knew. He tilted back in his desk chair, his mouth falling open. "Good God!" he said, not noticing the outstretched hand. "Have you come back?" Joe's hand fell. "Yes, I've come back to Canaan." Mr. Louden looked at him a long time without replying. Finally he remarked, "I see you've still got a scar on your forehead." "Oh, I've forgotten all about that," said the other, twisting his hat in his hands. 7 years wipes out a good many grievances and wrongs." "You think so?" Mr. Louden grunted. "I suppose it might wipe out a good deal with some people. How'd you happen to stop off at Canaan? On your way somewhere, I suppose?" "No, I've come back to stay." Mr. Loudon plainly received this as no pleasant surprise. "What for?" he asked slowly. "To practice law, Father." "What?" "Yes," said the young man. "There ought to be an opening here for me. I'm a graduate of as good a law school as there is in the country." "You are?" "Certainly," said Joe, quietly. "I put myself through, working in the summer." "Working!" Mr. Loudon snorted. "Side shows?" "Oh, worse than that sometimes," returned his son, laughing. "Anything I could get. But I've always wanted to come back home and work here." Mr. Loudon leaned forward, a hand on his knee, his brow deeply corrugated. "You think you'll get much practice in Canaan?" "Why not? I've had a year in a good office in New York since I left the school, and I think I ought to get along all right." "Oh," said Mr. Loudon, briefly. "You do?" "Yes. Don't you? Who do you think in Canaan would put a case in your hands?" "Oh, I don't expect to get anything important at the start. But after a while—" "With your reputation?" The smile which had faded from Joe's lips returned to them. "Oh, I know they thought I was a harum-scarum sort of boy," he answered lightly, "and that it was a foolish thing to run away for nothing. But you had said I mustn't come to you for help." "I meant it," said Mr. Loudon. "But that's 7 years ago, and I suppose the town's forgotten all about it, and forgotten me, too. So you see I can make a fresh start. That's what I came back for." "You've made up your mind to stay here, then?" "Yes." "I don't believe," said Mr. Loudon, with marked uneasiness, "that Mrs. Loudon will be willing to let you live with us." "No," said Joe, gently. "I didn't expect it." He turned to the window and looked out, averting his face, yet scoring himself with the contempt he had learned to feel for those who pity themselves. His father had not even asked him to sit down. There was a long silence, disturbed only by Mr. Loudon's breathing, which could be heard heavy and troubled. At last Joe turned again, smiling as before. "Well, I won't keep you from your work," he said. "I suppose you're pretty busy." "Yes, I am," responded his father, promptly. "But I'll see you again before you go. I want to give you some advice." "I'm not going," said Joe. "Not going to leave Canaan, I mean." "Where will I find Eugene?" "At the Tocsin office. He's the assistant editor. Judge Pike bought the Toscan last year, and he thinks a good deal of Eugene. Don't forget I said to come and see me again before you go." Joe came over to the older man and held out his hand. "Shake hands, Father," he said. Mr. Loudon looked at him out of small, implacable eyes, the steady hostility of which only his wife or the imperious Martin Pike, his employer, could quell. He shook his head. "I don't see any use in it," he answered. "It wouldn't mean anything. All my life I've been a hard-working man and an abiding man. Before you got in trouble you never did anything you ought to. You ran with the lowest people in town, and I and all your folks were ashamed of you. I don't see that we've got a call to be any different now." He swung round to his desk emphatically on the last word, and Joe turned away and went out quietly. But it was a bright morning to which he emerged from the outer doors of the factory, and he made his way towards Main Street at a lively gait. As he turned the corner opposite the National House, he walked into Mr. Eskew Arp. The old man drew back angrily. "Lord o' mercy!" cried Joe, heartily. "It's Mr. Arp! I almost ran you down." Then, as Mr. Arp made no response, he stood stock still in the way, staring at him fiercely. "Don't you know me, Mr. Arp?" the young man asked. "I'm Joe Loudon." Eskew abruptly thrust his face close to the other's. "No free seats!" he hissed savagely, and swept across to the hotel to set his world afire. Joe looked after the irate, receding figure and watched it disappear into the Main Street door of the National House. As the door closed he became aware of a mighty shadow upon the pavement, and turning beheld a fat young man, wearing upon his forehead a scarf similar to his own, waddling by with his eyes fixed upon him. "How are you, Norbert?" Joe began. "Don't you remember me?" "Ay." He came to a full stop as the fat one, thrusting out an under lip as his only token of recognition, passed balefully on. Joe proceeded slowly until he came to the Tocsin building. At the foot of the stairway leading up to the offices he hesitated for a few moments. Then he turned away and walked towards the quieter part of Main Street. Most of the people he met took no notice of him, only two or three giving him second glances of half cognizance, as though he reminded them of some one they could not place. And it was not until he had come near the Pike Mansion that he saw a full recognition in the eyes of one of the many whom he knew, and who had known him in his boyhood in the town. A lady, turning a corner, looked up carelessly, and then half stopped within a few feet of him as if startled. Joe's cheeks went a sudden crimson, for it was the lady of his old dreams. 7 years had made Mamie Pike only prettier. She had grown into her young womanhood with an ampleness that had nothing of over-sufficiency in it, nor anywhere a threat that some day there might be too much of her. Not quite 17 when he had last seen her, now at 24, her amber hair elaborately becoming a plump and regular face, all of her old charm came over him once more, and it immediately seemed to him that he saw clearly his real reason for coming back to Canaan. She had been the rich little girl of his child days, the golden princess playing in the palace grounds, and in his early boyhood, until he had grown wicked and shabby, he had been sometimes invited to the Pike Mansion for the games and ice cream of the daughter of the house before her dancing days began. He had gone timidly, not daring ever to "call" her in Quaker meeting or post office, but watching her reverently and surreptitiously and continually. She had always seemed to him the one thing of all the world most rare, most mysterious, most unapproachable. She had not offered an apparition less so in those days when he began to come under the suspicion of Canaan, when the old people began to look upon him hotly, the young people coldly. His very exclusion wove for him a glamour about her, and she was more than ever his moon, far, lovely, unattainable, and brilliant, never to be reached by his lifted arms, but only by his lifted eyes. Nor had his long absence obliterated that light. Somewhere in his dreams it always had place, shining, perhaps, with a fainter lustre as the years grew to 7, but never gone altogether. Now at last that he stood in her very presence again, it sprang to the full flood of its old brilliance, and more. As she came to her half stop of surprise, startled, he took his courage in two hands, and lifting his hat, stepped to her side. "You remember me?" he stammered. "Yes," she answered, a little breathlessly. "Ah, that's kind of you," he cried, and began to walk on with her unconsciously. "I feel like a returned ghost wandering about, invisible and unrecognized. So few people seem to remember me." "I think you're wrong. I think you'll find everybody remembers you," she responded, uneasily. "No, I'm afraid not," he began. I'm afraid they do." Joe laughed a little. "My father was saying something like that to me a while ago. He meant that they used to think me a great scapegrace here. Do you mean that?" "I'd scarcely like to say," she answered, her face growing more troubled, for they were close on the imperial domain. "But it's long ago, and I really didn't do anything so outrageous, it seems to me." He laughed again. "I know your father was angry with me once or twice, especially the night I hid on your porch to watch you dance, I mean. But you see I've come back to rehabilitate myself, to—" She interrupted him. They were not far from her gate, and she saw her father standing in the yard, directing a painter who was at work on one of the cast-iron biers. The Judge was apparently in good spirits, laughing with the workmen over some jest between them, but that did not lessen Mamie's nervousness. "Mr. Louden," she said, in as kindly a tone as she could, "I shall have to ask you not to walk with me. My father would not like it." Joe stopped with a jerk. "Why, I thought I'd go in and shake hands with him, and tell him I—" Astonishment that partook of terror and of awe spread itself instantly upon her face. "Good gracious!" she cried. "No!" "Very well," said Joe, humbly. "Good bye." He was too late to get away with any good grace. Judge Pike had seen them, and even as Joe turned to go, rushed down to the gate, flung it open, and motioned his daughter to enter. This he did with one wide sweep of his arm, and with another sweep forbade Joe to look upon either moon or sun. It was a magnificent gesture. It excluded the young man from the street, Judge Pike's street, and from the town, Judge Pike's town. It swept him from the earth, abolished him, denied him the right to breathe the common air, to be seen of men, and, at once a headsman's stroke and an excommunication, destroyed him soul and body, thus rebuking the silly providence that had created him, and repairing its mistake by annihilating him. This hurling Olympian gesture smote the street. The rails of the car track sprang and quivered with the shock. It thundered, and amid the dumbfounding uproar of the wrath of a god, the will of the Canaanite Jove wrote the words in fiery letters upon the ether: "Cease to be." Joe did not go in to shake hands with Judge Pike. He turned the next corner a moment later and went down the quiet street which led to the house which had been his home. He did not glance at that somewhat grim edifice, but passed it, his eyes averted, and stopped in front of the long, ramshackle cottage next door. The windows were boarded. The picket fence dropped even to the ground in some sections. The chimneys sagged and curved. The roof of the long porch sprinkled shingles over the unkempt yard with every wind, and seemed about to fall. The place was desolate with long emptiness and decay. It looked like a haunted house, and nailed to the padlocked gate was a sign, half obliterated with the winters it had fronted: "For sale or rent." Joe got himself meditatively back to Main Street and to the Tocsin building. This time he did not hesitate, but mounted the stairs and knocked upon the door of the assistant editor. "Oh," said Eugene, "you've turned up, have you?" Mr. Bantry of the Tocsin was not at all the Eugene rescued from the straw cellar. The present gentleman was more the electric freshman than the frightened adventurer whom Joe had encountered in New York. It was to be seen immediately that the assistant editor had nothing undaintily businesslike about him, nor was there the litter on his desk which one might have expected. He had the air of a gentleman dilettante, who amused himself slightly by spending an hour or two in the room now and then. It was the evolution to the perfect of his freshman manner, and his lively apparel, though somewhat chastened by an older taste, might have been foretold from that which had smitten Canaan 7 years before. He sat not at the orderly and handsome desk, but lay stretched upon a divan of green leather, smoking a cigar of purest ray and reading sleepily a small, verse-looking book in morocco. His occupation, his general air, the furniture of the room, and his title, doubtless equipped with a corresponding salary, might have inspired in an observant cynic the idea that here lay a pet of fortune, whose position had been the fruit of nepotism, or, mayhap, a successful wooing of some daughter, wife, or widow. Eugene looked competent for that. "I've come back to stay, 'Gene," said Joe. Bantry had dropped his book and raised himself on an elbow. "Exceedingly interesting," he said. "I suppose you'll try to find something to do. I don't think you could get a place here. Judge Pike owns the Tocsin, and I greatly fear he has a prejudice against you." "I expect he has," Joe chuckled somewhat sadly. "But I don't want newspaper work. I'm going to practice law." "By Jove, you have courage, my festive prodigal. Raiment!" Joe cocked his head to one side with his old look of the friendly puppy. "You always did like to talk that novelette way, 'Gene, didn't you?" he said, impersonally. 'Gene's color rose. "Have you saved anything to starve on?" he asked, crisply. "Oh, I'm not so badly off. Had a salary in an office for a year, and I had one pretty good day at the races." "You had better go back and have another," said his step brother. "You don't seem to comprehend your standing in Canaan." "I'm beginning to." Joe turned to the door. "It's funny, too, in a way. Well, I won't keep you any longer. I just stopped in to say good day." He paused, falteringly. All right," Eugene said, briskly. "And by the way, I haven't mentioned that I saw you in New York." "Oh, I didn't suppose that you would." "And you needn't say anything about it, I fancy." "I don't think," said Joe, "I don't think that you need to be afraid I'll do that. Good by. Be sure to shut the door, please. It's rather noisy with it open. Good by." Eugene waved his hand and sank back upon the divan. Joe went across the street to the National House. The Sages fell as silent as if he had been Martin Pike. They had just had the pleasure of hearing a telephone monologue by Mr. Brown, the clerk, to which they listened intently. "Yes, this is Brown. Oh, it's Judge Pike." "Yes, indeed, Judge. Yes, indeed. I hear you." "Of course. I understand. Yes, Judge. I heard he was in town." "No, he hasn't been here. Not yet, that is, Judge." "Yes, I hear." "No, I won't, of course." "Certainly not." "I will. I will. I hear perfectly. I understand." "Yes, sir. Good by, Judge." Joe had begun to write his name in the register. "My trunk is still at the station," he said. "I'll give you my check to send down for it." "Excuse me," said the clerk. "We have no rooms." "What?" cried Joe, innocently. "Why, I never knew more than 8 people to stay here at the same time in my life." "We have no rooms," repeated the clerk, curtly. "Is there a convention here?" "We have no rooms, I say." Joe looked up into the condensed eyes of Mr. Brown. "Oh," he said, "I see." Deathly silence followed him to the door. But as it closed behind him he heard the outbreak of the Sages like a tidal wave striking a dump heap of tin cans. 2 hours later he descended from an evil ark of a cab at the corral attached to Beaver Beach, and followed the path through the marsh to the crumbling pier. A red-bearded man was seated on a plank by the water edge, fishing. "Mike," said Joe, "have you got room for me? Can you take me in for a few days, until I find a place in town where they'll let me stay?" The red-bearded man rose slowly, pushed back his hat, and stared hard at the wanderer. Then he uttered a howl of joy and seized the other's hands in his and shook them wildly. "Glory be on high!" he shouted. "It's Joe Louden come back. We never knew how we missed ye till ye'd gone. Place fer ye. Can I find it? There ain't a impo petition in town, includin' myself, that wouldn't kill me if I couldn't. Ye'll have old Maggie's room, my old aunt's. You remember how she used to dance? She's been burnin' below these 4 years. And we'll have the celebration of your return this night. There'll be many of 'em to come when they hear ye're back in Canaan. Praise God! We'll all hope you're goin' to stay a while." End of chapter 8. Chapter 9 of the Conquest of Canaan by Booth Tarkington. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 9, Outer Darkness. If any echo of doubt concerning his undesirable conspicuousness sounded faintly in Joe's mind, It was silenced eftsoons. Canaan had not forgotten him, far from it, so far that it began pointing him out to strangers on the street the very day of his return. His course of action, likewise that of his friends, permitted him little obscurity, and when the rumors of his finally obtaining lodging at Beaver Beach and of the celebration of his installation there were presently confirmed, he stood in the limelight indeed, as a Mephistopheles upsprung through the trapdoor. The welcoming festivities had not been so discreetly conducted as to accord with the general policy of Beaver Beach. An unfortunate incident caused the arrest of one of the celebrators and the ambulancing to the hospital of another on the homeward way, the ensuing proceedings in court bringing to the whole affair a publicity devoutly unsought for. Mr. Happy Fear, such was the habitual name of the imprisoned gentleman, had to bear a great amount of harsh criticism for injuring a companion within the city limits after daylight, and for failing to observe that 3 policemen were not too distant from the scene of operations to engage therein. "Happy, if ye had in mind to harm him," said the red-bearded man to Mr. Fear upon the latter's return to society, "why didn't ye do it out here at the beach?" "Because," returned the indiscreet, "he didn't say what he was going to say till we got in town." Extraordinary probing on the part of the prosecutor had developed at the trial that the obnoxious speech had referred to the guest of the evening. The assaulted party, one Nashville Cory, was not of Canaan, but a bit of driftwood haply touching shore for the moment at Beaver Beach, and, strange is this world, that he had been introduced to the coterie of Mike's Place by Happy Fear himself, who had enjoyed a brief acquaintance with him on the day when both had chanced to travel incognito by the same freight. Naturally, Happy had felt responsible for the proper behavior of his protege, was in fact bound to enforce it. Additionally, Happy had once been saved from a term of imprisonment, at a time when it would have been more than ordinarily inconvenient, by help and advice from Joe, and he was not one to forget. Therefore he was grieved to observe that his own guest seemed to be somewhat jealous of the hero of the occasion, and disposed to look coldly upon him. The stranger, however, contented himself with innuendo, mere expressions of the face and other manners of things for which one could not squarely lay hands upon him, until such time as he and his sponsor had come to Main Street in the clear dawn on their way to Happy's apartment, a variable abode. It may be that the stranger perceived what Happy did not. The 3 bluecoats in the perspective, at all events, he now put into words of simple strength the unfavorable conception he had formed of Joe. The result was medievally immediate, and the period of Mr. Cory's convalescence in the hospital was almost half that of his sponsor's detention in the county jail. It needed nothing to finish Joe with the good people of Canaan. Had it needed anything, the trial of Happy Fear would have overspilled the necessity. An item of the testimony was that Joseph Louden had helped to carry one of the ladies present, a Miss Leroy, who had fainted, to the open air, and had jostled the stranger in passing. After this, the oldest woman in Canaan would not have dared to speak to Joe on the street, even if she wanted to, unless she happened to be very poor or very wicked. The Tocsin printed an adequate account, for there was a large public interest, recording in conclusion that Mr. Louden paid the culprit's fine, which was the largest in the power of the presiding judge in his mercy to bestow. Editorially, the Tocsin leaned to the facetious. Mr. Louden has but recently returned to our midst. We fervently hope that the distinguished Happy Fear will appreciate his patron's superb generosity. We say his patron, but perhaps we err in this. Were it not better to figure Mr. Louden as the lady in distress, Mr. Fear as the champion in the lists? In the present case, however, contrary to the rules of romance, the champion falls in duress and passes to the dungeon. We merely suggest, en passant, that some of our best citizens might deem it a wonderful and beauteous thing if, in addition to paying the fine, Mr. Loudon could serve for the loyal Happy his 6 months in the Bastille. En passant, if nothing else, would have revealed to Joe, in this imitation of a better trick, the hand of Eugene. And little doubt he would have agreed with Squire Buckalew in the Squire's answer to the easily expected comment of Mr. Arp. "Sometimes," said Eskew, "I think that Gene Bantry is just a little bit spitier than he is lazy. That's the first thing he's written in the Tocsin this month. One of the boys over there told me. He wrote it out of spite against Joe, but he'd ought to have done better. If his spite hadn't run away with what mind he's got, he'd have said that both Joe Loudon and that tramp Fear ought to have had 10 years." "Gene Bantry didn't write that out of spite," answered Buckalew. "He only thought he saw a chance to be kind of funny and please Judge Pike. The Judge has always thought Joe was a no-account—" "Ain't he right?" cried Arp. "I don't say he ain't." Squire Buckalew cast a glance at Mr. Brown, the clerk, and perceiving that he was listening, added, "The Judge always is right." "Yes, sir," said Colonel Flitcroft. "I can't stand up for Joe Loudon to any extent, but I don't think he done wrong," Buckalew went on, recovering, "when he paid this man Fear's fine." "You don't!" exclaimed Mr. Arp. "Why, haven't you got gumption enough to see—" "Look here, Eskew," interposed his antagonist, "how many friends have you got that hate to hear folks talk bad about you?" "Not a one." For once Eskew's guard was down, and his consistency led him to destruction. "Not a one. It ain't in human nature. They're bound to enjoy it. Got any friends that would fight for you?" Eskew walked straight into this hideous trap. "No. There ain't a dozen men ever lived that had. Caesar was a popular man, but he didn't have a soul to help him when the crowd lit on him, and I'll bet old Mark Antony was mighty glad they got him out in the yard before it happened. He wouldn't have lifted a finger without a gang behind him. Why, all Peter himself would do was to cut off an ear that wasn't no use to anybody. What are you trying to get at?" The Squire had him, and paused, and stroked his chin to make the ruin complete. "Then I reckon you'll have to admit," he murmured, "that while I ain't defendin' Joe Loudon's character, it was kind of proper for him to stand by a feller that wouldn't hear nothin' against him, and fought for him as soon as he did hear it." Eskew Arp rose from his chair and left the hotel. It was the only morning in all the days of the conclave when he was the first to leave. Squire Buckalew looked after the retreating figure, total triumph shining brazenly from his spectacles. "I expect," he explained modestly to the others, "I expect I don't think any more of Joe Loudon than he does, and I'll be glad when Canaan sees the last of him for good. But sometimes the temptation to argue with Eskew does lead me on to kind of get the better of him." When Happy Fear had suffered, with a give-and-take simplicity of patience, his allotment of months in durance, and was released and sent into the streets and sunshine once more, he knew that his first duty lay in the direction of a general apology to Joe. But the young man was no longer at Beaver Beach. The red-bearded proprietor dwelt alone there, and, receiving Happy with scorn and pity, directed him to retrace his footsteps to the town. "Ye must have been in the black hole of incarceration indeed if ye haven't heard that Mr. Loudon has his law office on the square, and his living room behind the office. It's in that little brick building straight across from the sheriff's door of the jail. Ye been neighbors this long time. A hard time the boy had persuading anyone to rent to him, but by paying double the price he got a place at last. He's a practicing lawyer now, praise the Lord, and all the boys and girls of our acquaintance go to him with their troubles. You'll see him with a murder case to try before long, as sure as you're not worth your salt. But I expect you can still call him by his name of Joe, all the same." It was a bleak and meagre little office into which Mr. Fear ushered himself to offer his amends. The cracked plaster of the walls was bare, save for dust. There were no shelves. The fat brown volumes, most of them fairly new, were piled in regular columns upon a cheap pine table. There was but one window, small paned and shadeless. An inner door of this sad chamber stood half ajar, permitting the visitor unreserved acquaintance with the domestic economy of the tenant, for it disclosed a second room, smaller than the office, and dependent upon the window of the latter for air and light. Behind a canvas camp cot, dimly visible in the obscurity of the inner apartment, stood a small gas stove, surmounted by a stewpan, from which projected the handle of a big tin spoon, so that it needed no ghost from the dead to whisper that Joseph Louden, attorney at law, did his own cooking. Indeed, he looked it. Upon the threshold of the second room reposed a small, worn, light brown scrub brush of a dog, so cosmopolitan in ancestry that his species was almost as undeterminable as the cast-iron dogs of the Pike Mansion. He greeted Mr. Fear hospitably, having been so lately an offcast of the streets himself that his adoption had taught him to lose only his old tremors, not his hopefulness. At the same time Joe rose quickly from the deal table, where he had been working with one hand in his hair, the other sprinkling ink from a bad pen. "Good for you, Happy!" he cried cheerfully. "I hoped you would come to see me today. I've been thinking about a job for you." "What kind of job?" asked the visitor, as they shook hands. "I need one bad enough, but you know there ain't nobody in Canaan would give me one, Joe." Joe pushed him into one of the two chairs which completed the furniture of his office. "Yes, there is. I've got an idea." "First," broke in Mr. Fear, fingering his shapeless hat and fixing his eyes upon it with embarrassment, "first let me say what I came here to say. Well," his embarrassment increased, and he paused, rubbing the hat between his hands. "About this job," Joe began. "We can fix it so " "No, you let me go on. I didn't mean fer to cause you no trouble when I lit on that loudmouth Nashville. I never thought they'd get me and you'd be dragged in, but I jest couldn't stand him no longer. He had me all wore out, all evening long, a hintin' and sniffin' and wearin' that kind of high smile 'cause they made so much fuss over you. And then when we got clear in town he come out with it, said you was too quiet to suit him, said he couldn't see nothin' to you. Well, I says to myself, just let him go on just one more, I says, then he gets it. And he did. Said you tromped on his foot on purpose. Said he knowed it, when the Lord a'mightiest fool on earth knows you never tromped on no one. Said you was one of the poorest young sports he ever see around a place like the beach. You see, he thought you was jest one of them fool bloods that come around raisin' a rumpus, and didn't know you was our friend and belonged out there, the same as me or Mike hisself. Go on, I says to myself, jest one more. He better go home to his mama, he says. He get in trouble if he don't. Somebody'll soak him if he hangs around in my company. I don't like his ways. Then I had to do it. There jest wasn't nothin' left. But I wouldn't have done you no harm by it." "You didn't do me any harm, Happy." "I mean your reputation." "I didn't have one, so nothing in the world could harm it. About your getting some work now." "I'll listen," said Happy, rather suspiciously. "You see," Joe went on, growing red, "I need a sort of janitor here." "What fer?" Mr. Fear interrupted, with some shortness. "To look after the place." "You mean these two rooms?" "There's a stairway, too," Joe put forth quickly. "It wouldn't be any sinecure, Happy. You'd earn your money. Don't be afraid of that." Mr. Fear straightened up, his burden of embarrassment gone from him, transferred to the other's shoulders. "There always was a yellow streak in you, Joe," he said firmly. "You're no good as a liar except when you're joking. A lot you need a janitor." You had no business to pay my fine. You ought to let me work it out. You think my eyes ain't good enough to see how much you needed the money, most of all right now when you're trying to get started? If I ever take a cent from you, I hope the hand I hold out for you'll rot off." "Now, don't say that, Happy," "I don't want a job nohow," said Mr. Fear, going to the door. "I don't want to work. There's plenty of ways for me to get along without that. But I've said what I come here to say, and I'll say one thing more. Don't you worry about getting law practice. Mike says you're going to get all you want, and if there ain't no other way, why, a few of us will go out and make some for you." These prophecies and promises, over which Joe chuckled at first, with his head cocked to one side, grew very soon, to his amazement, to wear a supernatural similarity to actual fulfillment. His friends brought him their own friends, such as had sinned against the laws of Canaan, those under the ban of the sheriff, those who had struck in anger, those who had stolen at night, those who owed and could not pay, those who lived by the dice, and to his other titles of notoriety was added that of defender of the poor and wicked. He found his hands full, especially after winning his first important case, on which occasion Canaan thought the jury mad, and was indignant with the puzzled judge, who could not see just how it had happened. Joe did not stop at that. He kept on winning cases, clearing the innocent and lightening the burdens of the guilty. He became the most dangerous attorney for the defense in Canaan. His honorable brethren, accepting the popular view of him, held him in personal contempt, but feared him professionally, for he proved that he knew more law than they thought existed, nor could any trick him, failing which many tempers were lost, but never Joe's. His practice was not all criminal, as shown by the peevish outburst of the eminent Buckalew, the squire's nephew, esteemed the foremost lawyer in Canaan. "Before long there won't be any use trying to foreclose a mortgage or collect a note, unless this shyster gets himself in jail." The wrath of Judge Martin Pike was august. There was a kind of solemnity in its immenseness. On a day when it befell that the shyster stood betwixt him and money, that was a momentous task, to stand between these two and separate them, to hold back the hand of Martin Pike from what it had reached out to grasp. It was in the matter of some tax titles which the magnate had acquired, and in court Joe treated the case with such horrifying simplicity that it seemed almost credible that the great man had counted upon the ignorance and besottedness of Joe's client, a hard-drinking, disreputable old farmer, to get his land away from him without paying for it. Now, as everyone knew such a thing to be ludicrously impossible, it was at once noised abroad in Canaan that Joe had helped to swindle Judge Pike out of a large sum of money. It was notorious that the shyster could bamboozle court and jury with his tricks, and it was felt that Joe Louden was getting into very deep waters indeed. This was serious. If the young man did not look out, he might find himself in the penitentiary. The Tocsin paragraphed him with a fine regularity after this, usually opening with a walrus, and the carpenter gravity. "The time has come when we must speak of a certain matter frankly," or, "At last the time has arrived when the demoralization of the bar caused by a certain criminal lawyer must be dealt with as it is, and without gloves." Once when Joe had saved a half-witted negro from the extreme penalty for murder, the Tocsin had declared, with great originality, "This is just the kind of thing that causes mobs and justifies them. If we are to continue to permit the worst class of malefactors to escape the consequences of their crimes through the unwholesome dexterities and the shifty manipulations and technicalities of a certain criminal lawyer, the time will come when an outraged citizenry may take the enforcement of the law in its own hands. Let us call a spade a spade. If Canaan's streets ever echo with the tread of a mob, the fault lies upon the head of Joseph Loudon, who has once more brought about a miscarriage of justice. Joe did not move into a larger office. He remained in the little room with its one window and its fine view of the jail. His clients were nearly all poor, and many of his fees quite literally nominal. Tatters and rags came up the narrow stairway to his door, tatters and rags and pitiful fineries. The blurred, the sodden, the flaunting and rouged, the furtive and weary, some in rags, some in tags, and some, the sorriest, in velvet gowns. With these, the distressed, the wrongdoers, the drunken, the dirty, and the very poor, his work lay, and his days and nights were spent. Ariel had told Roger Tabor that in time Joe might come to be what the town thought him, if it gave him no other chance. Only its dinginess and evil surrounded him. No respectable house was open to him. The bar-rooms, except that of the National House, welcomed him gratefully and admiringly. Once he went to church on a pleasant morning when nice girls wear pretty spring dresses. It gave him a thrill of delight to see them, to be near clean, good people once more. Inadvertently he took a seat by his stepmother, who rose with a slight rustle of silk and moved to another pew. And it happened, additionally, that this was the morning that the minister, fired by the Tocsin's warnings, had chosen to preach on the subject of Joe himself. The outcast returned to his own kind. No lady spoke to him upon the street. Mamie Pike had passed him with averted eyes since her first meeting with him, but the shunning and snubbing of a young man by a pretty girl had never yet, if done in a certain way, prevented him from continuing to be in love with her. Mamie did it in the certain way. Joe did not wince, therefore it hurt all the more. For blows from which one cringes lose much of their force. The town dog had been given a bad name, painted solid black from head to heel. He was a storm center of scandal. The entrance to his dingy stairway was in square view of the National House, and the result is imaginable. How many of Joe's clients, especially those sorriest of the velvet gowns, were conjectured to ascend his stairs for reason more convivial than legal? Yes, he lived with his own kind, and so far as the rest of Canaan was concerned, might as well have worn the scarlet letter on his breast or branded on his forehead. When he went about the streets, he was made to feel his condition by the elaborate avoidance, yet furtive attention, of every respectable person he met. And when he came home to his small rooms and shut the door behind him, he was as one who has been hissed and shamed in public, and runs to bury his hot face in his pillow. He petted his mongrel extravagantly, well he might, and would sit with him in his rooms at night, holding long converse with him, the two alone together. The dog was not his only confidant. There came to be another, a more and more frequent partner to their conversations, at least a familiar spirit. This third came from a brown jug which Joe kept on a shelf in his bedroom, a vessel too frequently replenished. When the day's work was done, he shut himself up, drank alone and drank hard. Sometimes when the jug ran low and the night was late he would go out for a walk with his dog, and would awake in his room the next morning not remembering where he had gone or how he had come home. Once, after such a lapse of memory, he woke amazed to find himself at Beaver Beach, whither, he learned from the red-bearded man, Happy Fear had brought him, having found him wandering dazedly in a field near by. These lapses grew more frequent, until there occurred that which was one of the strange things of his life. It was a June night, a little more than 2 years after his return to Canaan, and the Tocsin had that day announced the approaching marriage of Eugene Bantry and his employer's daughter. Joe ate nothing during the day, and went through his work clumsily, visiting the bedroom shelf at intervals. At 10 in the evening he went out to have the jug refilled, but from the moment he left his door and the fresh air struck his face, he had no clear knowledge of what he did, or of what went on about him, until he woke in his bed the next morning. And yet whatever little part of the soul of him remained, that night, still undulled, not numbed, but alive, was in some strange manner lifted out of its pain towards a strange delight. His body was an automaton, his mind in bondage, yet there was a still small consciousness in him which knew that in his wandering something incredible and unexpected was happening. What this was he did not know, could not see, though his eyes were open, could not have told himself any more than a baby could tell why it laughs. But it seemed something so beautiful and wonderful that the night became a night of perfume, its breezes bearing the music of harps and violins, while nightingales sang from the maples that bordered the streets of Canaan. End of chapter 9. Chapter 10 of The Conquest of Canaan by Booth Tarkington. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 10. The Tryst. He woke in the light of morning, amazed and full of a strange wonder, because he did not know what had amazed him. For a little while after his eyes opened, he lay quite motionless. Then he lifted his head slightly and shook it with some caution. This had come to be custom. The operation assured him of the worst. The room swam round him, and with a faint groan he let his head fall back upon the pillow. But he could not sleep again. Pain stung its way through his heart as memory began to come back to him. Not of the preceding night, that was all blank, but realization that a girl of whom he had dreamed so long was to be married. That his dreams had been quite hopeless was no balm to his hurt. A chime of bells sounded from a church steeple across the square, ringing out in assured righteousness, summoning the good people who maintained them to come and sit beneath them or be taken to task. And they fell so dismally upon Joe's ear that he bestirred himself and rose, to the delight of his mongrel, who leaped upon him joyfully. An hour later, or thereabout, the pair emerged from the narrow stairway and stood for a moment, blinking in the fair sunshine, apparently undecided which way to go. The church bells were silent. There was no breeze. The air trembled a little with the deep pipings of the organ across the square, and, save for that, the town was very quiet. The paths which crossed the courthouse yard were flecked with steady shadow, the strong young foliage of the maples not moving, having the air of observing the Sabbath with propriety. There were benches here and there along the walks, and to one of these Joe crossed and sat down. The mongrel, at his master's feet, rolled on his back in morning ecstasy, ceased abruptly to roll, and began to scratch his ear with a hind foot intently. A tiny hand stretched to pat his head, and the dog licked it appreciatively. It belonged to a hard-washed young lady of 6, in starchy white frills and new pink ribbons, who had run ahead of her mother, a belated church-goer, and the mongrel charmed her. "Will you give me this dog?" she asked, without any tedious formalities. Involuntarily she departed before receiving a reply. The mother, a red-faced matron whom Joe recognized as a sister of Mrs. Louden's, consequently his step-aunt, swooped at the child with a rush and rustle of silk, and bore her on violently to her duty. When they had gone a little way, the matron's voice was heard in a sharp reproof. The child, held by one wrist and hurried along on tiptoe, staring back over one shoulder at Joe, her eyes wide and her mouth the shape of the O he was ejaculating. The dog looked up with wistful inquiry at his master, who cocked an eyebrow at him in return, wearing much the same expression. The mother and child disappeared within the church doors and left the square to the two. Even the hotel showed no signs of life, for the wise men were not allowed to foregather on Sundays. The organ had ceased to stir the air, and all was in quiet, yet a quiet which for Loudon was not peace. He looked at his watch, and without intending it, spoke the hour aloud. 11:15. The sound of his own voice gave him a little shock. He rose without knowing why, and as he did so, it seemed to him that he heard close to his ear another voice, a woman's, troubled and insistent, but clear and sweet, saying, "Remember, across Main Street, bridge at noon." It was so distinct that he started and looked around. Then he laughed. "I'll be seeing circus parades next." His laughter fled, for louder than the ringing in his ears unmistakably came the strains of a faraway brass band, which had no existence on land or sea or in the waters under the earth. "Here," he said to the mongrel, "we need a walk, I think. Let you and me move on before the camels turn the corner." The music followed him to the street, where he turned westward toward the river, and presently, as he walked on, fanning himself with his straw hat, it faded and was gone. But the voice he had heard returned. "Remember, across Main Street, bridge at noon," it said again, close to his ear. This time he did not start. "All right," he answered, wiping his forehead. "If you'll let me alone, I'll be there." At a dingy saloon corner near the river, a shabby little man greeted him heartily and petted the mongrel. "I'm mighty glad you didn't go, after all, Joe," he added, with a brightening face. "Go where, Happy?" Mr. Fear looked grave. "Don't you reflect meeting me last night?" Joe shook his head. "No, did I?" The other's jaw fell, and his brow corrugated with self-reproach. "Well, if that don't show what a thickhead I am. I thought ye was all right, or I'd 'a' gone on with ye. Nobody seed or walked straighter nor talked straighter. Said you was going to leave Canaan for good, and didn't want nobody to know it. Said you was going to take the 11 o'clock through the train for the West, and told me I couldn't come to the depot with you. Said you'd had enough of Canaan and of everything. I followed you part way to the depot, but you turned and made a motion for me to go back, and I done it, because you seemed to be kind of in trouble, and I thought you'd rather be by yourself. Well, sir, it's one on me." "Not at all," said Joe. "I was all right." "Was you?" returned the other. "Do remember, do you?" "Almost," Joe smiled faintly. "Almost," echoed Happy, shaking his head seriously. "I tell you, Joe, if I was you," he began slowly, then paused and shook his head again. He seemed on the point of delivering some advice, but evidently perceiving the snobbishness of such a proceeding, or else convinced by his own experience of the futility of it, he swerved to cheerfulness. "I hear the boys is all going to work hard for the primaries. Mike says you got some chances you don't know about. He swears you'll be the next mayor of Canaan." "Nonsense, folly and nonsense, Happy. That's the kind of thing I used to think when I was a boy, but now pshaw!" Joe broke off with a tired laugh. "Tell them not to waste their time. Are you going out to the beach this afternoon?" The little man lowered his eyes moodily. "I'll be near there," he said, scraping his patched shoe up and down the curbstone. "That feller's in town again." "What fellow?" "Nashville, they call him. Ed's the name he give the hospital. Cory. Him that I soaked the night you come back to Canaan. He's after Claudine to git his evens with me. He made a raise somewhere, and plays the spender. And her, well, I reckon she's tired waiting table at the National House. Tired of me, too. I got a hint that they're going out to the beach together this afternoon." Joe passed his hand wearily over his aching forehead. "I understand," he said, "but you'd better try to. Cory's laying for you, of course. You say he's after your wife? He must have said about it pretty openly if they're going to the beach today, for there's always a crowd there on Sundays. Is it hard for you to see why he's doing it? It's because he wants to make you jealous. What for? So that you'll tackle him again. And why does he want that? Because he's ready for you." The other's eyes suddenly became bloodshot, his nostrils expanding incredibly. "Ready, is he? He better be ready. That's enough," Joe interrupted swiftly. "We'll have no talk like that. I'll settle this for you myself. You send word to Claudine that I want to see her in my office tomorrow morning, and you stay away from the beach today. Give me your word." Mr. Fear's expression softened. "All right, Joe," he said. "I'll do whatever you tell me to. Any of us will do that. We sure know who's our friend. Keep out of trouble, Happy." Joe turned to go, and they shook hands. "Good day, and keep out of trouble." When he had gone, Mr. Fear's countenance again gloomed ominously, and, shaking his head, he ruminatively entered an adjacent bar through the alley door. The Main Street bridge was an old-fashioned wooden covered one, dust-colored and very narrow, squarely framing the fair open country beyond, for the town had never crossed the river. Joe found the cool shadow in the bridge gracious to his hot brow, and through the slender chinks of the worn flooring he caught bright glimpses of running water. When he came out of the other end he felt enough refreshed to light a cigar. "Well, here I am," he said, "across Main Street bridge, and it must be getting on toward noon." He spoke almost with the aspect of daring, and immediately stood still, listening. "Remember, remember," he ventured to repeat, again daring. "Remember, across Main Street bridge at noon." And again he listened. Then he chuckled faintly with relief, for the voice did not return. "Thank God I've got rid of that," he whispered, "and of the circus band, too." A dust road turned to the right, following the river and shaded by big sycamores on the bank. The mongrel, intensely preoccupied with this road, scampered away, his nose to the ground. "Good enough," said the master. "Lead on, and I'll come after you." But he had not far to follow. The chase led him to a half-hollow log which lay on a low, grass-grown levee above the stream, where the dog's interest in the pursuit became vivid. Temporarily, however, for after a few minutes of agitated investigation he was seized with indifference to the whole world, panting briefly, slept. Joe sat upon the log which was in the shade, and smoked. "Remember," he tried it once more, "across Main Street bridge at noon." Safety still. The voice came not. But the sound of his own repetition of the words brought him an eerie tremor. For the midst of a memory came with it, nothing tangible, nothing definite, but something very far away and shadowy, yet just poignant enough to give him a queer feeling that he was really keeping an appointment here. Was it with some water sprite that would rise from the river? Was it with a dryad of the sycamores? He knew too well that he might expect strange fancies to get hold of him this morning. And, as this one grew uncannily stronger, he moved his head briskly as if to shake it off. The result surprised him. The fancy remained, but his headache and dizziness had left him. A breeze wandered up the river and touched the leaves and grass to life. Sparrows hopped and chirped in the branches, absurdly surprised, without doubt having concluded in the Sunday stillness that the world would drowse forever. And the mongrel lifted his head, blinked at them, hopelessly wishing they would alight near him, scratched his ear with the manner of one who had neglected such matters overlong, reversed his position, slept again. The young corn, deep green in the bottomland, moved with a staccato flurry, and the dust ghost of a mad whirling dervish sped up the main road to vanish at the bridge in a climax of lunacy. The stirring air brought a smell of blossoms, the distance took on faint lavender hazes which blended the outlines of the fields, lying like square coverlets upon the long slope of rising ground beyond the bottomland, and empurpled the blue woodland shadows of the groves. For the first time it struck Joe that it was a beautiful day, and it came to him that a beautiful day was a thing which nothing except death, sickness, or imprisonment could take from him, not even the ban of Canaan. Unforewarned, music sounded in his ears again, but he did not shrink from it now. This was not the circus band he had heard as he left the square, but a melody like a faraway serenade at night, as of the horns of Elfland faintly blowing, and he closed his eyes with the sweetness of it. "Go ahead," he whispered. "Do that all you want to. If you'll keep it up like this a while, I'll follow with Little Brown Jug, How I Love Thee. It seems to pay, after all." The welcome strains, however, were but the prelude to a harsher sound which interrupted and annihilated them, the courthouse bell clanging out 12. "All right," said Joe. "It's noon, and I'm across Main Street bridge." He opened his eyes and looked about him whimsically. Then he shook his head again. A lady had just emerged from the bridge and was coming toward him. It would be hard to get at Joe's first impressions of her. We can find conveyance for only the broadest and heaviest. Ancient and modern instances multiply the case of the sleeper who dreams out a long story in accurate color and fine detail, a tale of years in the opening and shutting of a door. So with Joseph, in the brief space of the lady's approach. And with him, as with the sleeper, it must have been, in fact it was, in his recollections later, a blur of emotion. At first sight of her, perhaps it was preeminently the shock of seeing anything so exquisite where he had expected to see nothing at all. For she was exquisite. Horrid as have been the uses of the word, its best and truest belonged to her. She was that and much more, from the ivory ferrule of the parasol she carried to the light and slender footprint she left in the dust of the road. Joe knew at once that nothing like her had ever before been seen in Canaan. He had little knowledge of the millinery arts, and he needed none to see the harmony like that of the day he had discovered a little while ago. Her dress and hat and gloves and parasol showed a pale lavender overtint like that which he had seen overspreading the western slope. Afterward he discovered that the gloves she wore that day were gray, and that her hat was of the most part white. The charm of fabric and tint belonging to what she wore was no shame to her, not being of primal importance beyond herself. It was but the expression of her daintiness, and the adjunct of it. She was tall, but if Joe could have spoken or thought of her as slender, he would have been capable of calling her lips red, in which case he would not have been Joe, and would have been as far from the truth as her lips were from red, or as her supreme delicateness was from mere slenderness. Under the summer hat, her very dark hair swept back over her temples with something near trimness, in the extent to which it was withheld from being fluffy. It may be that this approach to trimness, which was, after all, only a sort of coquetry with trimness, is the true key to the mystery of the vision of the lady who appeared to Joe. Let us say that she suppressed everything that went beyond grace, that the hint of floridity was abhorrent to her. Trim is as clumsy as slender. She had escaped from the trimness of girlhood as wholly as she had gone through its coltishness. Exquisite. Let us go back to Joe's own blurred first thought of her and be content with that. She was to pass him, so he thought, and as she drew near, his breath came faster. Remember across Main Street bridge at noon? Was this the Fay of whom the voice had warned him? With that there befell him the mystery of last night. He did not remember, but it was as if he lived again, dimly, the highest hour of happiness in a life 1,000 years ago. Perfume and music, roses, nightingales, and plucked harp strings. Yes, something wonderful was happening to him. She had stopped directly in front of him, stopped and stood looking at him with her clear eyes. He did not lift his own to hers. He had long experience of the averted gaze of women, but it was not only that. A great shyness beset him. He had risen and removed his hat, trying, ineffectually, not to clear his throat, his everyday sense urging him that she was a stranger in Canaan who had lost her way. The preposterousness of any one's losing the way in Canaan not just now appealing to his everyday sense. "Can I?" he stammered, blushing miserably, meaning to finish with "direct you" or "show you the way." Then he looked at her again and saw what seemed to him the strangest sight of his life. The lady's eyes had filled with tears, filled and overfilled. "I'll sit here on the log with you," she said, and her voice was the voice which he had heard saying, "Remember, across Main Street bridge at noon." "What?" he gasped. "You don't need to dust it," she went on tremulously. And even then he did not know who she was. Chapter 10